The Meaning of Marxism by Paul D'Amato. Chapter 2. Marx's Materialist Method. Section header. Why Theory Matters. The last thesis that Marx jotted down in 1845 was this: the philosophers have merely interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. One way to interpret this statement is as an argument against theory. We don't need theory. That's for professors and intellectuals who like to debate and to no particular end. We just need to fight for what we know is right. You don't need a weatherman, goes the 1960s Bob Dylan song, to know which way the wind blows. While people might declare that ideas about society are a waste of time, they wouldn't say the same thing about what we call the hard sciences. No one would ever say, "Who needs physics?" except maybe bored high school students. All of our modern technology, from digital electronics to airplanes and computers, was developed on the basis of science. Scientific theory helps us get beneath the surface appearance of things and to understand the underlying laws that govern their behavior. Scientific theories are explanations about why and how things happen that are not apparent through immediate observation. If we lived on a planet where nothing ever changed, there would be little to do, wrote science writer Carl Sagan. Quote, "There would be nothing to figure out. There would be no impetus for science. And if we lived in an unpredictable world, where things changed in random or complex ways, we would not be able to figure things out. Again, there would be no such thing as science. But we live in an in-between universe, where things change, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature." End quote. How do we know whether or not a theory is right or wrong? It has to be tested in practice. A scientific theory can be invalidated if it is falsified. That is, if examples or results are found that the theory cannot explain. In biology, a theory must be able to explain why things evolve in one way and not another. Wrong theories produce bad, if not useless, practical results, or they cannot explain every case they are meant to explain. Indeed, the proof of a scientific theory's soundness lies, with some exceptions, in its ability to predict behavior, whether practical experiments can reproduce what it predicts will happen, or whether the practical applications developed out of the theory actually work. That isn't to say that science is completely neutral. Obviously, the fact that governments and businesses spend more time and money on things like nuclear weaponry than on curing disease tells us something about the way capitalism shapes scientific inquiry. Nevertheless, the whole purpose of science, for good or ill, is to assist in changing reality. Scientists, in other words, must be able to interpret the world in order to change it. This holds true, perversely, also with the atomic bomb, if we replace change with destroy. What about society? Marx's little quip at the beginning was written as an attack on armchair thinkers, people who talked but did nothing. He didn't really think that there was no point in interpreting the world. Rather, he thought there was no point interpreting the world unless you were trying to change it. Ideas divorced from practice are free to float in the stratosphere, where one is as good as the next, or are useless, as anyone who has been at a graduate school wine and cheese party can attest. For the capitalists attempting to improve production techniques and outsell their competitor, science can be harnessed to suit their needs. But we live in a society that is divided into a small minority of very wealthy exploiters and a majority of people who work or starve. All societies that are divided into a minority class of exploiters and a majority class of exploited require for their functioning a set of ideas that reinforce class domination. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. Marx and Engels wrote, quote, "The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships." End quote. The ruling capitalist class, whom Marx and Engels referred to as the bourgeoisie, certainly harnesses ideas to its needs. But it does so for the purpose of justifying its rule, not changing the unequal relations between rich and poor in society, but keeping them the way they are. The fact that the United States was founded on conquest of Indians and enslavement of Africans, or that the legal system favors the rich over the poor, or that the workers here had to go on strike to get an 8-hour day, is not going to be prominent in most high school textbooks. History reflects the ruling ideology. The ruling ideas are ideas meant to bolster the status quo, not explain or challenge it. An example of this would be the idea that strikes and social movements are caused by outside agitators, or a minority of troublemakers, a common refrain among employers and their political hirelings throughout the history of the U.S. labor movement. The argument conveys the idea that ordinary people are too happy with their lot to want to fight against their own oppression, but are gullible and therefore easily duped by Machiavellian leftists. The assumption is also that the victims of injustice lack the wit or the will to challenge their superiors, that they are incapable of acting on their own grievance and rationally choosing their allies, writes radical British author Mike Marcuse. Historians and sociologists usually make more sophisticated arguments than this, but their sophistication is not necessarily an indication that they are any more insightful. Indeed, often less crude, more superficially impressive arguments are more useful in bolstering the status quo. Marx challenged the bourgeois. He used the word bourgeois interchangeably with capitalist, economists of his time, saying that for them, it wasn't a question of whether this theorem or that theorem was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, politically dangerous or not. More than that, the social sciences routinely set out to discredit anyone who puts forth the idea that class and class struggle are central to history. Lenin put it this way, quote, "Throughout the civilized world, the teachings of Marx evoke the utmost hostility and hatred of all bourgeois science, both official and liberal, which regards Marxism as a kind of pernicious sect. And no other attitude is to be expected, for there can be no impartial social science in a society based on class struggle. In one way or another, all official and liberal science defends wage slavery, whereas Marxism has declared relentless war on wage slavery. To expect science to be impartial in a wage-slave society is as silly and naive as to expect impartiality from manufacturers on the question of whether workers' wages should be increased by decreasing the profits of capital. End quote. Insofar, Marx argued, as a real critical understanding of society represents a class, it can only represent the class whose vocation in history is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes, i.e. the proletariat. By this, Marx did not mean that to get an accurate answer to a question, you just need to walk up and ask a UPS worker. He meant that only movements of ordinary workers in struggle, seeking ways to challenge the world, require as a condition of success a real picture of the dynamics of society, rather than the one presented on TV and in the history books. But common sense tells us that truth is about impartiality, finding the golden mean between different positions. If you take a side, you can't be balanced, and therefore you can't get at the truth. Take the example of the debate in the courts and school boards over intelligent design. The view that life is a product of a supernatural creator rather than biological evolution. The media has often presented both sides as if they were part of a legitimate debate. The problem here is that this form of the presentation constitutes a surrender to the right-wing Christian advocates of intelligent design, whose entire strategy consists of attempting to push through local laws that permit equal treatment of intelligent design and Darwinian evolution in schools. Intelligent design is in fact a more watered-down version of plain old biblical creationism. The idea that a Christian God is responsible for the creation of all life, and that evolution is an abomination. They pretend that intelligent design, a view that by definition cannot be tested because the creator is supernatural and therefore outside the bounds of rational inquiry, is a scientific theory rather than part of a religious faith. By presenting intelligent design, i.e. religious dogma, as a legitimate contender with evolution, science, the media has in fact played straight into the hands of intelligent design's proponents. The irony is that it is only by taking sides in a fight to change the world, on the side of the oppressed and exploited, will you have both the need and the capacity to understand how things work. For example, if I, as a worker, I believe that bosses are reasonable people who are looking for ways to improve my wages, I will act accordingly. I'll go and ask politely at the manager's door for a raise. But I will quickly learn that my theory about the bosses won't get me very far. Employers raise wages in response to a labor shortage or to a struggle. But, all other things being equal, they aren't interested in cutting to their own profits by increasing the wages of their workers. Unfortunately, when looking at a society, it is often accepted that one theory is as good as another. Imagine if physics were approached this way. You say the Earth revolves around the Sun, I say the Sun revolves around the Earth. Who's to say what's correct? But if we are to intervene in society practically and actually change it, flat Earth sociology won't do. We'll need to go beyond common sense ideas that help bolster the status quo, like people are poor because there isn't enough to go around, or immigrants steal our jobs, poor people are lazy, or our government invades other countries to liberate people. What is there to recommend one view of society over any other view? For Marx and Engels, the question of whether this or that view of the world was correct was something that had to be tested against experience. The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking, Marx wrote, is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, the this worldliness of his thinking and practice. End quote. Debating the truth or non-truth of any idea without reference to the real world was purely a scholastic question. Working-class people are not blank slates, but carry with them a variety of different, often contradictory ideas, some of which reflect the ruling ideas, and some which challenge them. For example, the same person who supports unions as a way to better conditions on the job may also hold racist ideas. Another may oppose racism, but accept sexist ideas about women. They may not be conscious about these ideas, some of which reinforce solidarity and liberation, others that reinforce division and oppression, are contradictory. The importance of clear ideas becomes more obvious in the course of mass action, when there are all kinds of debates about which way forward. The founder of Russian Marxism, Georgy Plekhanov, wrote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement." By this, he did not mean that we have to have all of our ideas sorted out before we can fight for a better world. What he did mean is that if our side, the side of the downtrodden, the mistreated, the exploited, is eventually to triumph and build a new society, it must have its own set of coherent ideas, its own worldview that counters that of the ruling class. A coherent worldview is shaped in part in the course of challenging capitalism, but it is also shaped by coming to grips with the historical experience of past struggles, and by scientifically investigating the way our society works. In the eyes of a Philistine, a revolutionary point of view is virtually equivalent to an absence of scientific objectivity, observed Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. Quote, "We think just the opposite. Only a revolutionist, provided, of course, that he is equipped with the scientific method, is capable of laying bare the objective dynamics of revolution. Apprehending thought is in general not contemplative, but active. The element of will is indispensable for penetrating the secrets of nature and society. Just as a surgeon, on whose scalpel a human life depends, distinguishes with extreme care the various tissues of an organism, so a revolutionist, if he has a serious attitude towards his task, is obliged with strict conscientiousness to analyze the structure of society, its functions, and reflexes." End of section.